Hi, ladies! In this clip from the Redeeming Women Bible Series, Episode 2, I discuss how Sarai has a recommendation for Abram to have children using a very unconventional means. This was modern day surrogacy in a very different way than we might expect. And she uses her servant Haggar to be able to accomplish this particular recommendation. In that, there is a redemptive arc for Haggar that you may not be expecting, and it also will signal how we can have a redemptive arc that perhaps we're not necessarily expecting, but it is exactly the right way that God would want to see us redeemed. Take a listen. Abram's wife, Sarai, starts to be concerned. She starts to be concerned about how they're supposed to sustain their lineage and their resources and everything they have if they're getting old and they haven't had any kids. So in all this time, 10 plus years has gone by since the famine in Egypt, since them leaving their land that they've always known, and yet they have nothing to show for it other than all the money and the servants that they have. And so this was Sarai's suggestion to Abram. It says in chapter 16 of Genesis, verse 1, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Haggar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.'" Now, I know that sounds crazy. I don't even think, I personally would never make such a suggestion to my husband. Like, what? Free? No, no, right? But we have to understand the culture and the time period that we're living in. When we read the Bible in general, we cannot try to superimpose our morality, our culture, our belief systems that have been culturally appropriated, or things that have been defined by the current space and time we live in, into this text. Because even though this is a timeless work that benefits you and me and beyond us, it was still written during a period of time by human beings whom were inspired by God to write this stuff down. And so they're going to write into it their cultural norms, belief systems, the way they lived. And part of the way they lived was that oftentimes if there wasn't any descendants, or if there wasn't any children in the family, then they used maidservants in order to have children through and maintain the family line. This was a very important thing because otherwise their resources would be completely done for and taken over by some other people group. And so Abram's wife is trying to protect her family by suggesting that Abram do this. So let's not judge her too harshly, because this was her understanding of how things worked. And if we were in the same position, we probably would have behaved in the same way, because that would have been the only way we knew how to resolve this problem. But alas, this is indeed her taking matters into her own hands. And we see again that instead of going to God and talking to God, she doesn't. Even though she knows that Abram has had conversations with God over and over and over about this covenant and then having mighty descendants, populating the earth and all this stuff, regardless of that, she still chooses to trust her own instincts instead of going to God and trusting God, which, if we're all honest, we've all done it. Let's continue. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Right, isn't that kind of convenient? I mean, sure, why not? Why would he say no to that, right? So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, right? So we said 10 years or so had passed. Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. So Abram has the opportunity to sleep with Sarai's maidservant Hagar. She becomes his wife. So now she's given a new title and status, and she is pregnant with Abram's child, which is going to pose some big problems for Sarai in a moment. Here's what it says in verse 4. It says, when she knew she was pregnant, when Haggar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. So Haggar started despising Sarai. This is interesting. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Yeah, they kind of walked themselves into that now, didn't they? Because Haggar was essentially lesser ranked in the total pool of things, right? Technically, Abram's wife would take priority over Sarai's maidservant. But because Abram made her his wife in order to appease Sarai, now she's been given equal playing field with Sarai, and even more so, perhaps higher playing field because she's having his baby. This is a big conundrum, and we see that Haggar starts to despise Sarai as a result. She starts to see her as less than, perhaps, which isn't a good thing, but is the consequences for Sarai's recommendation. Had never been brought to God for any opinion, advice, or anything, right? So she says, may the Lord judge between you and me. In other words, Sarai is saying, may God judge us for this. But if we have to be honest, Sarai worked herself into this trap. Like, she could have talked to God about this and she just never did. So this is how Abram responds, which I think is interesting too. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Haggar, so she fled from her. Now I find that very interesting. Abram, what he ends up doing is that he ends up bringing Sarai's maidservant Haggar back down to her maidservant status. He says to her, your slave is in your hands. Like, instead of treating her as his wife, because technically that's what she became the minute that they conceived, instead of treating her as his wife, he treats her like the servant that she had always been, because Abram never chose this. He never desired this. This was not his recommendation. Sarai recommended this. And we know that this is not ideal. Even though polygamy was a normal custom in biblical times, this is not what God's intention is for human beings. And we see that from the beginning, because he made Adam, he made woman, and then later she'd be called Eve. And that was enough. There wasn't going to be a need for these polygamous relationships, but polygamy became a custom that human beings brought into the fold because of their sin. So he puts her back to the slave position, tells her to do whatever she thinks is best, and she ends up mistreating Haggar. So now they go tit for tat. Haggar had despised her, and she started mistreating her. What that mistreatment looked like, I don't know, but clearly it was enough for Haggar to run away. So Sarai takes matters into her own hands, and then now Haggar takes matters into her own hands and decides to run away. Which, if we'd be in her position, I'm sure we all would have done the same thing. The angel of the Lord found Haggar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Haggar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Right. So the angel of the Lord. So finally God is talking. And there's a lot of speculation as to what the angel of the Lord is. Some people say it's Jesus. Other people believe it's the Holy Spirit. Other people believe that it's just God himself. Either way, the presence of God is here, and he is communicating. And he is approaching Haggar in her slave position, in her slave identity. He's saying, Haggar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And it's interesting that we see yet again God in his infinite wisdom asking Hagar a question he already knows the answer to. The same way that he asked Adam, why are you hiding, or where are you, is the same way that now God is asking Hagar the same question. Where have you come from and where are you going? Because he wants to see what she's going to say, even though he already knows, but he's so interested in having a relationship with us that he wants to hear her talk and express herself. And so this is what Hagar says. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. Oh, goodness. What? Okay. I get it. Okay, I'm reacting. I have the reactions too. The reactions are boiling in me because it's like, why would you go back to the person who was abusing you, to the person who was mistreating you? You never chose to go with Abram and Sarai. They took you. You never chose this life, but you were given over because of your status in Egypt. Pharaoh gave you over to Abram as a servant, so you were relegated to this position, and now all has occurred. You never suggested sleeping with Abram. That was something Sarai said to do, and now here you are running away from her because you're trying to save your life. And this angel is saying to go back after Sarai. Sarai was the one that started this whole mess. She's the one that started this whole mess. And if you think about it, when we take matters into our own hands, we need to be careful because the consequences will not only impact us, they're going to impact all the people that surround us. And God, regardless, is going to show up and show out for people, even the ones that are around us that are being impacted by our consequences, because we see that here with Hagar. But nevertheless, it doesn't change the fact that we should be careful with the decisions we make. We can't be so indecisive. And I say this, ladies, because we tend to be this way sometimes. We tend to be very indecisive. We start making decisions, then we want to backpedal and backtrack on those decisions. We need to be careful because those decisions will impact other people's lives. And that includes our kids, that includes our families, that includes everybody, our employers, you name it. So we need to tread lightly whenever we're going to make a big decision. So the angel tells her to go back, which sucks. Hagar has to go back to the person who hurt her. It's outrageous, but here's what God tells her. I will increase your descendants so much that you will be too numerous to count. Right? Hagar is promised descendants too numerous to count, which in those days was a big deal because it meant that her lineage would live on forever. She was not going to get forgotten or discarded. She was going to have all these families come after her, and that was going to secure her place as a person of value. God saw her, and God saw her value, and he saw to it that her descendants would be numerous. Then the angel of the Lord also said, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. So the baby in her womb is a boy. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. So God heard of her misery. He cared for her misery, right? He knew what was going on, and this is how he responds. This young man Ishmael will be a wild donkey of a man. His hands will be against everyone, and everyone's hands against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. All this can be found in chapter 16, verses 10 through 12. Now, it's interesting because as I read this, Hagar is seen by God. She's recognized. Her misery is recognized. She's told that her descendants would be numerous, but that doesn't mean that they won't be full of strife. God is laying out the framework for what this young man's life would look like. And indeed, it would be a life in which he would have a lot of hostility. That's just the way that it was going to be. And why that is, I don't know for certain. But what I do know is that it is probably because it's bred from such a sinful situation. One sinful act after the other is what led to this. And so within this child's loins, sin is running rampant. And that's how sin decided to manifest itself in this kind of way, that this young man would then grow up to be in hostility with all his brothers, to always be in conflict. Let's continue. It says she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. So Haggar gave God a name. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. After this conversation, Haggar decides to name God. She calls him the God who sees her, El Roi, God El Roi, the God who sees her. And what a fitting name that is, because she was not acknowledged, she was not cared for, she was essentially running away for her dear life because her mistress had mistreated her, Sarai, right? There was so much conflict there. All of Sarai's doing, because Abram never suggested this, nor did Haggar. But yet God recognized her misery. He chose to allow her to conceive, and he chose to allow her to know that she's going to have many descendants. And because of this, Haggar recognized that God had seen her. And now taking it back to us as women, when I think about the redemption of Haggar, knowing that this was going to happen to her as a result, we are in a position where we can be redeemed also, because God doesn't just see Haggar. God sees us too. He sees you. He sees me. And if we are honest, he sees us all the time. And he knows everything we go through. It doesn't matter what trials we face, what tribulations we face. God's not promising that we won't have suffering. We see that Haggar is going to suffer. She's going to have to go back and submit to this mistress, and she's going to have to deal with all of this stuff. But God was going to be with her, and he made that very clear to her. And she then said, you are the God who sees me. You are the God who sees me. And God sees you. And he sees me. So no matter what it is that we're going through, no matter what the problems are, no matter what strife, no matter what sins we commit, God sees us. He knows us. And he wants us to know that we are seen, known, and valued. We are important to him. He loves us immensely so. This is why the whole Bible has been written, because of his love for us, to share with us who he is, so that we could know him and we could love him just as he knows us and he loves us.